Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. See, the spirit is willing. It's that pesky flesh, that part of us that is us, that is pretty weak sometimes. You know, this truth over almost, later on this year, I'll be celebrating 20 years of doing ministry in intern, part-time, or full-time capacity, which is pretty cool. But in 2 decades, what it's shown me is that people's lives weigh in the balance of this. How do we balance what God's amazing power is versus the push and pull, the ebb and flow of us and what we want to do versus what God wants for us. And as we follow Him and as we surrender it to Him, that we have His Holy Spirit within us. You know, I get messages like these all the time. And there's no names. These are from years ago. But I've gotten similar messages even within the last week. Hey, Jason, I'm done. I have to leave him. He doesn't try, and every time I'm ready to go, he does something nice, but it's only briefly. I feel like I'm the only one trying. I'm tempted to go and look elsewhere for love and affection. The more I think about it, the more I want to go. Should I stay? Should I go? We've been married for 15 years, but it's so hard. How do you fight the feeling of wanting to leave when everything in your heart tells you to stay? How can God help us and really help me through this? Another message. My kid, no matter how much I implore them to do the right thing, keeps doing the opposite. I know teenagers have a tendency to do it, but after 3 years of destructive behavior, my wife and I are tempted to throw them out. It's been building, and the option seems to be the last-ditch effort to get through to them. Would God be mad if we let our kid live with the choices that they're making? They have to learn the right way, and nothing we have done is working. I don't know that any parent is ever prepared or is told to be prepared for the moment their child dives into this deep anger and addiction. What do we do? You know, I could go on and on for days of the emails and phone calls and text messages and meetings at 2 a.m., at 1 in the afternoon, of moments where people say, I wish that at some point someone had unpacked for me that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. It's like we grab one package, one bag that we carry, and we say, all right, I have God's Spirit with me. He's a part of me. I have this together. I know that He says, I know that He promises. Because if you are a believer and you've sat down, my hope is, my desire is, my assumption, and maybe I shouldn't even move into assumptions, is that we've sat down and studied and read that God says He will be and is with us, and He gives us a Spirit to help us. I know sometimes we look at this like a Jiminy Cricket type thing, that He sits on there and He's, the whole let your conscience be your guide. But then we say, all right, well, I have the Spirit and I'm walking through that and I'm doing that. But this, God, what you don't understand is that the flesh, the Spirit is willing, and I hear you, but God, you don't understand because the flesh is heavy. God, I wish you could be here to see this battle in my life. God, what do I do? Because I want to follow you, but I want to leave them. God, I want to follow you, but should I kick them out? God, I want to follow you, but this feels good. The back and forth happens to every single one of us. And the thing is, until we put it into a physical object where we're able to see it, for some of us, we feel the weight, but we don't even understand this reality. You see, these fires that we go through, they're going to happen. The temptations that come in your life and in mine, the battle between the spirit and the flesh is going to happen. And that's not to be a downer, that's to help give us hope, to give us and be prepared that in case of fire, in case of temptation, because it's going to happen, do you and I have a plan? Because fires, once they get roaring, takes a lot of people and energy and effort to put them out. But I don't need to tell you that. You already know that. Because if you haven't walked through it yet, the promise is, yay, the new year, that at one point you're going to encounter a fire and it's going to take you and blindside you. Because we're focused on work and snow days and bills and kids and relationships and should I go out and I'm single, does God love me? Is this a curse? Is this a blessing? Should I go out to that place? Should I date him? Should I date her? Should I stay at this job? And we have all of these things. And then the fire pops up out of our peripheral because, again, we're blinded by what we're doing. Clock in, clock out, go through life, binge a series, go to bed, restart the clock and move forward, that this begins to burn. And then the struggle is, how do I put this out? Because now it's a raging fire and I had no idea it was there. And then we get to passages like we're about to get into, and, well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. If you have a Bible, I'd love for you to turn over to the book of James, chapter 1. It's in the New Testament of the Bible. If you don't have a Bible, we give them away for free in the lobby at the Get Connected table. Stop by there, pick up your brand new Bible. That's yours to keep, write in it, highlight in it, carry it around with you, read it, marinate over the words, because it is not simply a book, it is life-giving, heart and soul movement of God. Maybe for you, you don't want to carry around one, and that's fine. You could download a Bible app, or we provide the Forefront Church app that has a Bible and notes and all sorts of things to help keep you connected to what's happening here, because we believe when we're connected to a living, breathing, moving community, that God's going to do miraculous things. And I can guarantee you that in 2017, when we look at the climate of our world, which we absolutely love, that God absolutely loves, we can see pockets of hurt, of pain, of uncertainty. And I think all of us need to be a part of something bigger than ourselves that is going to give life back, not only to us, but to others. And so we want you to use these tools. And over in James chapter 1, where we're going to be in a moment, James is the half-brother of Jesus. And growing up in the shadow of Jesus, he honestly didn't believe in the claims that Jesus made that he was indeed the Son of God. It wasn't until much later in his life, being the half-brother of Jesus, that he came to a place where he believed the claims to be true, which I kind of like about James, because he wasn't just one of these people that walked in blindly. I'm kind of pragmatic in nature, and I like to think on things and mill over things, and sometimes a little skeptical. And so I like James because I see a little bit of myself, and much like some of you guys. We're like, I'm not sure about that yet, but I'm willing to walk it out. And what James did is he walked it out, and he found that God did indeed send his son through Jesus, his half-brother, to come and have this amazing ministry and set this example for life. And he started following this and being a part of churches and helping and writing. And near his time of death, he wrote this book this book to help us understand about life. Not to one particular church, because a lot of the books in the New Testament are written to specific groups that we can glean understanding from. He writes it to all people, and this letter would have been passed around more so than many of the other letters. And he writes it to people who want to follow Jesus and to give them encouragement. But I want to give you caution that what we're about to read, in the face of this spirit and flesh battle, there's a part of me that loves this passage because it gives me so much hope. There's another part of me that, well, let's just read it and we'll unpack this a little bit more. Consider it pure joy, starting in verse 2, my brothers and sisters. So see, he's not addressing people that don't know God. He's addressing people that have now come to claim him. And so if you're new with us this morning, if you have not yet taken a step to follow Jesus this morning, this is good news because you're able to look at this even through a different vein and go, oh, this is how people who say they claim to follow Jesus are supposed to act. Now, if you follow Jesus this morning, if you have claimed him, you have walked through what God has instructed you to live in your life, you have been baptized, you have moved through this time that God has called you to these things, this might be encouraging and or angering. Consider it pure joy, brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish of your faith, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance, let it finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. Cool. I'm going to get from God because I ask him and all these other things. But then we get to that first part of that verse. Consider it joy when you face things that test your flesh, because the spirit is willing and the flesh is weak. And so lean into the spirit, because your flesh is going to go do really dumb stuff. So don't do this. Lean into this. And when you encounter things that are really hard, be joyful. All of a sudden I start humming, here's a little song I wrote. Don't worry. I think of these things and I go, God, that doesn't make sense. I'm not going to not worry and be happy and be joyful because this is hard, and I don't think you get and this is the conversation I had with God. That sounds great to ask of you things, but do you understand the human condition? You know, the people that you made? Because this is hard. And the last thing I want to do when I'm struggling with this and trying to lean into this is go, yay! God, thank you. Thank you. You're so good. You love me. You really love me. No, I want to get frustrated, because it's so hard to battle through this, to get to this place. It's just difficult. There's this lighthouse on Bell Rock Island. You'll see it here. Absolutely beautiful. This is a recent shot that was taken within the last year. It's 11 miles off the coast of Scotland. It is the oldest sea-washed lighthouse in the world. It was built in between 1807 and 1810. Absolutely immaculate, and it's near Scotland. But the thing is, with the way that it was built, really kind of paints the picture of how tired we get of this. In case of fires, we're trying to do these things, this flesh versus spirit battle. You see, in this, when they were building this lighthouse, you could see that they're having to go, because it was about 11 miles off the coast. You could barely see it from the coastline, and they would have to paddle out they would go out in ships and then drop down into these small boats and go out, because you see that during a 24-hour period, for 10 hours, it would be where they needed to build the base in this small rock formation completely underwater. You could see it here in this photo. You cannot see the base of this lighthouse. For every 10 hours that the tide made it underwater, they would then have 2 hours. So 10, 2 minimal hours to get off on the boats, do everything, and then get back out. So now you only have roughly, by the time you unload everything, about an hour's worth of work before the tide then covers it for another 10 hours. Now we're getting into darkness, and then it's opened up for another 2. So they had 2 hours worth of work in the 4-hour window by the time they had 30 minutes on, 30 minutes off to complete this lighthouse, which took them 2 years. Anybody want to sign up for that job? All of us are like, nah, Jack. Like, how in the world? In 1807, they're working on this. Newsflash, before there were all kinds of power tools and things. All right? Is they're working on this. And I look at this and I go, man, that's us. That we go through a 24-hour period and we go, man, you know what? Life is hard, God. Life is difficult, and you've handed me the Spirit, and you think that in that window of this relationship that somehow I'm going to be able to stand under this? And there's a difficulty because the internal dialogue can get to, God, I feel like you've set me up for failure. God, I feel like I'm never going to be good enough. Now, I'm sure I'm only talking about my inner dialogue, and you have high self-esteem and feel absolutely great. And you feel like you can conquer it all. Well, the reality is, for most of us, that battle rages on inside of us. And no matter where you fall on the scale of your journey, whether you're still trying to figure this out or you've been with God for a really long time, and this is really great news. If you're sitting here this morning and you're like, I haven't taken that step with God yet, we're in the same boat with you. We're in this together. This is hard. This is really, really hard. Because we place our identity, when we fail, we place it in our failures. I'm not good enough. How could I have done better? I can't overcome this. And then all of a sudden we have these joys, and we're supposed to hand it to who? To God. We're supposed to point all of our joys, all of our happiness. And so when things go well, yay God. When things go bad, boo me. And our identity begins to get latched in these. And here, as I was writing down notes and walking through this is something that I've been challenged with, is that our identity is not in our joy, and our identity is not in our failings. Our identity is in Jesus. Whether we have joy or have failed. And here's the thing. Because if we don't put it in Jesus, we're going to put it in these 2 pieces. And here's the problem for the majority of mankind, is that the flesh is weak. And so we don't have a plan to overcome that, and so we feel like our identity is just falling end over end, and we feel like it's a never-ending set of dominoes. We don't feel like we can ever stand up to what's happening. But James, the half-brother of Jesus, writes some amazingly encouraging remarks that help encourage me, and my prayer is that they'll encourage you. In that same passage that we were looking at over in verse 12, he shares this. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. And so we're getting some amazing, all right, if I can stand firm, you could read this, if I have a plan, if I have an escape route, because I know, remember we talked about this, that the fires are going to come, the flesh is weak, the Spirit's willing, the Spirit's like, rah, rah, yeah, I'm that flexible, right? Pumped, we're excited, we're going to do this, but the flesh is weak. This is encouragement from James. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. This is where I have to stop and apologize to God. Because I cannot tell you the number of times that something has happened and I gave way to it because the flesh is weak. I said, God, why did you do this? And immediately God's response, not audibly, is, I did nothing. I gave you the power to overcome it. I gave you the Spirit. The problem is you just wanted to do it. Which is why last week in our online service we said that we start naming things a certain way, And we start looking at them in a certain vein, and instead of saying, oh, I felt this or felt that, say, no, I was either obedient or disobedient. When you're parenting a kid and they do something wrong, you just go, man, you really fell for that whole lion thing. No, you go, you were disobedient, and then you're either punished or taught a lesson about that. But we get into this false narrative. When we're tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are, and this is so key, because we've now embraced a culture where no one takes responsibility. We pass the buck on to somebody else. And I'm not pointing at culture, I'm pointing again at, you know who could change this? The number of believers that are in the world. If believers started taking responsibility for the fact that we fall, for the fact that we have temptations, for the fact that we sin, and said, hey, I'm sorry for that. But each person is tempted when they're dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after that desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, and this is what's hard, gives birth to death. The moment that you and I fall short, we've completely missed the mark that God has for us. That's what sin is, missing the mark. That God has a target for our life, but you and I shoot arrows to the left and right and up and down and backwards and hitting all sorts of things other than the target. Yeah, we may hit the target some, but we miss a lot because we make mistakes. We fall short. And what this passage is opening up and saying is, listen, you can persevere because the Spirit is willing, the Spirit is strong, the Spirit is amazing, but the flesh is weak. And if you get nothing else, I pray that you hear this, and every week we have a takeaway, and this is it, is that a fire plan makes you brave. Planning to battle your weaknesses shows your strength. Taking the time to say, I know that the flesh is weak. I know that the Spirit is willing, but I know that this is really, really hard. So I'm going to lean into God. See, the reason that we keep falling into this cycle is because we don't plan ahead. And we don't even take temptation seriously. Why is it that 8% of people follow through with their New Year's resolutions while 92% fail in the first 2 weeks? First 2 weeks. We are already outside of the first 2 weeks, which means that 92% of people around the world have already failed. That's not very encouraging odds. But I love this quote by Jillian Michaels. She put it this way. She said, the overwhelming majority of people with a plan, accountability, and drive see significant change. It's because they, and this is huge, and she wasn't preaching a sermon, but she was preaching when she said this. It's because they have a way out and a way forward. Those are huge words, a way out and a way forward. With a plan, accountability. Nobody likes this because we don't want to be told what to do. None of us like to. And don't say that you like to either. Like, don't lie to yourself right now. Don't say, I love when people tell me what to do. Now you're a liar too. Now you don't like to be told what to do and you're lying. We're all sinners. We are all messed up, but we all have the beauty and opportunity for God's grace. And so when we hear, we go, sure, I'll make a plan. I'll write that down on a napkin and put that somewhere to forget it. But accountability, somebody who knows the plan, who's going to push us, well, I'm not going to let anybody tell me what to do. Like when we get into these things and then all of a sudden if you're in a relationship, you have somebody else to hold you accountable, that goes super well. Hey, I made this thing. I'm going to totally do this. I don't want you to hold me accountable. If you're in a husband and wife relationship, good luck. Hey, I thought you were on that diet thing that we were talking about. Get away from me. Like, yeah, like you get that, right? Or you have a friend that's like, hey, we're going to work out, whatever. And then they text you at 4 a.m. and you block their number. Why? Because none of us want accountability. And then we get into the things that no one addresses. Your marriage, your relationships, your parenting. God forbid, our finances. I'm going to speak into my finances. That's my money. That's the first problem that we have, that we think it's actually ours. That God has given us those things. And so we get into all this accountability and drive. I mean, I got to actually work. I got to actually put forth effort. Yes. Because God is great and God is absolutely amazing, but God wants to know that you have stake in the game, that you want to be a part of this. And so we say the overwhelming majority of people with a plan, accountability, and drive, significant change. If you say, I haven't seen significant change, it's because you made a bad plan, you don't like people telling you what to do, and you're lazy. Those are the opposite of those things. Don't get mad at me. That's what God shares with us. And he's saying, you want to do this? Then step up. Because we love the stories when we see people that have a plan and have accountability and have drive, and we go, I want that. Look at the last 5 to 6 months, a year, and you said you were going to do something. Did you actually do it? If not, then you didn't have a plan, you didn't want accountability, and you wanted to be lazy. And I say this because this happens in my life, but we see significant change when we embrace those, when we have a way out in this plan and a way forward with accountability and drive. And then we look at our faith and we go, I don't know why God's not helping me more. I went to church once and nothing changed. Or I've gone for 10 years and I haven't seen a change, so God must not love me. Your faith is a lifestyle, not a checklist. You need a checklist to feel good, join a gym, not a church. You see, Forefront Church is a hospital for the wrecked, beaten down, broken, hurting, been corrupted by something that somebody did to them, that a church may have wounded them, that we are here to be a hospital for people that are hurting, but not just to come into a hospital, because what happens when you get into a hospital? You get well, and then you go back out. We become rescue workers. But you have this battle that's going on, and here's the problem, is that all the time, you and I looked at this is the flesh and this is the spirit, when we got to turn it around and say God's spirit is willing. And my flesh is so small compared to how big my God is. And I need to turn this around. Because there is no temptation that I have encountered, and we talked about this in week 1, that is not common to mankind. And God can overcome it because the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And the reason that we fail is because we reverse them. And so how do we look at temptation? What are the truths about temptation? Very quickly, what you see isn't what you get. When it comes to temptation, the very opening moments of the Bible, Adam and Eve. The serpent comes and shares with Eve, why don't you try this fruit? It will be amazing. You will know God is lying to you. And she goes and takes hold of the fruit and then gives it to her husband. And we jokingly, say, the men are like, oh, well, Eve ate it first. Well, that account says that she turned to her husband, who was standing there going, derp, 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 and then handed it to him, who he was not leading well, which is this whole interaction of how the man leads well, not in this, like tyrant thing, but the man leads his wife well, and she's able to follow him well because he's such an amazing, godly man. And instead, in the very beginning, Adam, she eats the fruit, hands it to him. And what they were told is not what they received. Another piece of this is that the pressure of giving in to temptation is far less than the pressure of the consequences after it. How many times have you thought, said, or wrote down in a journal, if I could go back and change blank? We could sit on that the rest of the year. Man, if I could go back and change that, that would be such an amazing thing. Why? Because temptation tells us that is going to be A-okay. Run with that. And then we do, and the consequences, the giving in and living with what's left in the wreckage is huge. Because you see, the bait looks good until you take it. How many fish? people go out and cast that lure slowly and bring it, slowly toy with it, move it around. And eventually that fish sees what's on the hook and says, that is good, and then bites into it and then goes, oh snap. The reality and understanding of the pain of the hook becomes all too real when temptation is taken and bitten into, because the bait looks good until you take it. And yes, the spirit is willing, and yes, the flesh is weak, but when we get them reversed, this is huge. And here's the deal, that giving in increases giving in again and again and again and again, because it never seems to satisfy. But the beauty of this principle is it goes both ways, not just with temptation, but moving towards God and His Spirit. Because it's just like, let's take running, for instance. If you get up and run, the first time you run, you're like, God, Jesus, take the wheel. Like, I can't make it to the end of the block. But then you get up again and you're like, I made it to the end of the block. And then all of a sudden you're like, I made it around the block. What? And then I made it 1 mile, and then 4 miles, and then 5 miles. But what happens when you miss a day? You're like, man, this is a snow day. Then the next morning you wake up, you're like, I didn't run yesterday. I'm going to do it the next day. Man, we're going to go to church tomorrow. We're going to be a part of that. Wake up, man, I just slept on my neck wrong, really neat. Yeah, we'll go to 5 p.m. They got that 5 p.m. We're going to go to that. Then the game comes on. That struggle's real. Well, I'll just catch the podcast. You ain't catching the podcast. Next Sunday. You want to know about temptation? You live it every single day. Gives in and gives in. Christians are free to say no to temptation. That is a reality that over in the New Testament, this guy Paul in the book of Romans writes, so he says, you have been set free from sin. You have been redeemed. You can move forward. But far too often, we switch it up. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And God's like, no, you've got it backwards. The flesh is weak, but the spirit, how I move in you, how I have guided you, how I love you, how I have grace for you, it is strong, and it just, that this stuff pales in comparison to my power, my love, and my grace. Why do we get it twisted? Because we put our identity in our failings, not in the Father. So we continue to think that we can't say no when we can. But here is the beauty about temptation and the reality of God's grace, is that your past doesn't have to define you. Doesn't have to define you. I almost put in there, your past doesn't define you, but here's the problem. It doesn't have to, but far too often we take what's happened in the past and in our present and we overlay it over our future because we get it mixed up that the flesh is weak and that the spirit is willing, and we put our identity in our failings and our failures instead of the Father. And so we put all of that past into our future, and we already are destined to fail because we're going to give in to the temptation and the fire each and every time. But it does not have to be that way, because a fire plan will make you brave. A fire plan will make you so brave that you can conquer those things, that you won't get it mixed up, and you will look and you say, the spirit is willing, the flesh is weak, and God gave me enough power and strength to overcome, and you were going to see that. But He gives us caution. The writer gives us caution and tells us, watch and pray. I find it interesting that we have to have these plans, and even when we have these plans, it says, stop, watch and pray, that you'll not fall into that temptation. And I almost think before we get to the fire, it's the temptation of switching the two. That God's not big enough to handle what's coming next, and so when it comes next, not only do we not have a plan, we don't believe we have a God big enough to handle it. The reality is the spirit is huge, and it is willing and able. The flesh is tiny and weak, and God can overcome it. But are we prepared to walk it out with Him? Would you pray with me?